Thank you very much, Maximo. And then I'd like to ask our speakers to come to the desk here. And we'll have some time to have some questions from the audience. I would ask you to introduce yourself when you come with a question, and please be brief on the question so that the panelists can spend more time on the answer. So, do we have a volunteer? Okay, there's somebody over here. Yes.
Tom Timberg, consultant. A lot of stimulating thoughts, but I would really be interested in having some address to the possibilities of pulse legume exports, because it seems to me that this is very dependent on what develops as far as regional connections, obviously, especially with India. So it's connected with the development of transport connections, and it's also connected with Indian government policy, and whether they, for example, they are facing a pulse problem, but their response might well be to protect their own market. So if somebody could speak to that.
Perhaps we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll go to our panel. There's one right here.
Lex Riefel with the Brookings Institution. Question for Dr. Zhou. The National Economic and Social Advisory Council in April issued a white paper on ag sector reform. I'd be interested in your assessment of that. It looked to me like an outstanding roadmap for reform for the new administration. I was wondering if you expect the NLD government to proceed along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and one more question this round. Right here. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm a member of the UNESCO Task Force, and we prioritize starting from this year, September, to identify best practices, including for agriculture. In your presentation, you mentioned seeds, fertilizer, irrigation. Is it generally for the productivity, quality, or you focus there on nutrition? But what about productivity in agriculture? How does it relate? What is more important, fertilizer, irrigation, seed, or everything together? My second question, you have 7 states, and also you have a range of producers. Is there any idea that you should specialize either at the country level or state by state on some producers? Thank you.
Okay, let's give our panelists the chance to respond. Dr. Zhou?
Thank you, Paul. With the question regarding pulses in India, I think this is it's a very important question. This is the situation where I think probably all the wise men of the IFPRI can also help us achieve this task at hand. India is a monopoly of all the pulses that we produce, that they actually buy it. And then we are also quite a big producer. So until the Canadians, Americans, and Australians are coming into the market, we are the only supplier to India. But unfortunately, what we have failed by both governments is we have never really been able to build a long-term relationship. So we haven't really got any kind of a price, the future arrangements and purchasing arrangements, and then where we can really build a good value chain connecting India to connecting the Indian markets to the Burmese farmers. In fact, it is not that difficult to do because we have a very historic tradition where we were part of the British India, and then we were actually responsible for food security in India. Now, I think this is coming back because recently the Prime Minister Modi has established what it is called the Pulse Sufficiency Scheme. That scheme is a domestic scheme to help the Indian farmers to produce pulses sufficient for the domestic market. But still, in all the analysis that the Indian economists have done, they don't really, there's a huge gaps. So we are actually trying to talk to the Indians government that we should be able to consider as one of their kind of what they call the Indian has also recently, like China, have a one road strategy. It's a Silk Road strategy. The Indian has what it is called the neighborhood strategy. So then we are trying to get into the Indians government that neighborhood strategy where we may be able to work something. But unfortunately, one of the reasons that the Indians actually cannot establish the long-term purchase agreement with us is, interestingly, it is because of the financial sanctions imposed by the United States. And this is where you have a very dicey situation where we can't really have a transaction directly between India and Myanmar, but we have to go do it through the middlemen who are located in Singapore. I think this is how our trade and value chain has already distorted by some of these situations, and hopefully I think we might be able to correct that very soon. On the second question about the agriculture white paper, you have named U Tin To, who is one of the who used to be the chairman of the NISAC, which is the advisory committee where I'm also a member. And but NISAC was already dissolved because it was an advisory committee for the previous government. But U Tin To actually joined CESC as the chairman of the new board. We had just recently reformed our governance structures. And we help quite a bit. In fact, the Michigan State University and the IFPRI also helped him write that report. And that report is now actually getting a lot of attention in Naypyidaw. And in this week, actually, many of my colleagues are trying to translate the whole report because originally it was written in, we have to write in English because we also need to get a lot of feedbacks from the experts from IFPRI and the Michigan State University as well as other development partners. And then now we are actually translating the full report in Myanmar, and then we are actually publishing it. And because of the new interest from Naypyidaw. And the basic message there is, yes, the reforms in agriculture is not just within the agriculture. It's what Justin has said. It is outside of the agriculture, the Ministry of the Agriculture. This is where we also need to look into the value chain and try to upgrade and try to fill all the gaps in the value chains. And assessing the global value chains is also a very key part of that. And then the second message is that we have been too much reliant on the rice. Because we used to be the rice bowl of Asia. There was a bit of a nostalgic attachment to the rice. And that we have been too much focusing and specializing on rice. But if you look at the rice economy around us, and then there were a lot of Thais, Vietnamese, Indians, they are also good at exporting rice right now. So we can actually can specialize in other things like what Justin has said on the fruits, vegetables, and then also the beans and pulses, and then also the edible oil is also another crop which can actually meet the demands of the domestic market. And so the message was that we need to diversify the agriculture sector. And then the third one is about the institution building. And then this is where we need a lot of work to be done in terms of revamping our extension services, increasing the budget for the research. You know, our R&D budget for agriculture is a very, very small amount compared to the irrigation. So we really need to do that. And then we also need to also build the whole chain of quality infrastructure where we can actually produce and then we can process it so that we can sell it to the high-end markets.
Thank you. Justin, would you have something to add?
I think I agree with everything Dr. Zhou said. I would just say on the, maybe an anecdote on the white paper, which also USAID supported along with CSD and IFPRI and Michigan State and Nathan Associates, is that when our administrator, Gail Smith, was recently in Myanmar, the Minister of Agriculture, including Da Su, elevated the paper with it in hand and talked about how we can achieve this. So it's actually becoming a paper that very much is being read by the main policymakers in the country, and really understanding, one of the things that we are working very hard to do is to sort of stimulate a transparent policy process, so we can get input from different stakeholders and sort of make sure that there's a policy dialogue happening. And that was really one of the focus of the papers. And I think it's absolutely achieved that. So we are hopeful that the government really is going to use that somewhat as a framework with how to continue. And then I'll pass it on to Maximo.
Maximo?
Yeah, only three comments on the white paper. I also read it, and it had all the correct words. The idea of moving from one producer to a kind of a supermarket agribusiness approach, I think, is the correct way to go, and market-oriented. The only things that we need to be careful is how this is going to be implemented.
Yes.
And what are the basic institutional innovations that you need. And one of those, which is extremely complex, I think, is land rights issues. So that's something to focus and trying to see how to move forward. But it looked extremely good. On the question on pulses, I fully agree. But again, it's not only India, although now India is becoming increasingly important. So something to explore, but also you need to diversify, and see how you can diversify that. On the question on inputs, my answer to that will be the first two components that I put on inputs and seeds and fertilizers and so on was look towards productivity, was not towards nutrition. What I was saying is also, depending on the value chains you focus, you can give certain biases towards more nutritious food. But looking at the productivity issue, and that's why I put access and availability on the other side. For me, the best way to go is soil maps, identify which are the problems, and then target the proper solutions. Normally, we go blindly with packages, and we don't know what the soil is requiring. And doing soil maps of good quality are not so expensive. So I think, especially if you want to diversify your commodity set, and to decide in which region to produce that's where the soil map plays a crucial role, because it could alert you which commodities you can produce, and then you can look at comparative advantages based on the windows of times where you can supply. And that's where I think the specialization of state by state could go. So that's the way I think it should move forward.
Okay, thank you. Another round of questions. Right here. Remember to state your name.
Yeah, Xin Diao from IFPRI. I know today's panel and presentation are mainly for global value chain. We use this term. I'd like to ask another side question, actually domestic market. So Maxim point out the constraint infrastructure and many things that gave us a kind of disadvantage in terms of competing with our neighbors in global market. But sometimes this kind of disadvantage gave us opportunity to develop our domestic market. So import substitution policy, and also the demand driven by the urbanization. So especially for those commodities also relate to Maxim's question about the malnutrition, such like fish and chicken and many other actually non-traditional agricultural commodities that we don't talk a lot. So my question is, so how much actually the government actually pay attention to this kind of commodity? They may not for export, but they are mainly for domestic market with a huge potential to grow, and most of them produced by smallholders.
Thank you. Another question.
Hi, Francis Smart, Michigan State University. I'm just wondering, how do you stimulate like diversity of crops that you're talking about? What kind of policies, or just how do you move forward with that?
Another question.
My name is Tom Spengler. I'm with PCI. It's Project Concern International. And it's very interesting presentations given today, and very much focused on the potential for very accelerated economic growth, but understanding that there's tremendous social and governance change ongoing at the same time. I'd be interested in your perspectives on how we contribute to make sure that those are mutually beneficial, understanding that economic growth, if not very deliberately approached, can undermine some of these social and governance reforms, and likewise, some of the social and governance reforms may, as you pointed out, kind of run counter. So as an implementing organization, as a PVO, looking to really contribute to kind of future social and economic development, how do you, and Justin in particular, from the USAID side, there's been a lot of focus on this layering and sequencing and integration of different investments. How would you see international PVOs entering into that from both social and agricultural development perspective?
Great. Well, we've got a set of wide-ranging questions there. Saul?
Thank you for raising a very important question. Domestic market. I wonder whether you notice what the Massimo has used in one of the slides. There's a 1 billion worth of import on palm oil. This is where I think palm oil is actually supplying our domestic use, that we used to actually produce a lot of edible oil, peanut oil, the sunflower, and a number of oil that we use for cooking. And so it's one of the very stable food that our Burmese families need to rely on everyday basis. And this is where I think some of those government policies can go wrong. You know, palm oil was subsidized to import, and then also at the time when we actually face some shortages in terms of producing our domestic oil, it would have been much better than we subsidize our farmers to produce more productive edible oil production. And it could have been we could have actually make farmers more income. At the same time, we can produce self-sufficiently available edible oil in the domestic market. And if you add the nutrition into this dimension, I think then it's completely become so mind-boggling, because palm oil is, as you see, it's not very fit for eating. Actually, a lot of palm oil are used for the industry. So we are eating them. So I think in that regard, I think we really have to look into some of these situations. And this is where we are now also working in the dry zone, where we have a lot of edible oil, the peanuts, and then also the sesame are being grown. And then so we are also looking into the value chains to understand how to boost the production so that we can actually meet the demands of the domestic market. In terms of universities, I think this is where we have a very challenging situation where our universities are completely disconnected from the market as well as from the public policies. Mainly because we have a very historic role of the student activism, and then the universities as being seen as a hotbed of all the opposition movement. So I think the government actually tried to disconnect the universities from other social sectors. So now we are actually trying to reintegrate the universities into our real life, where I think one of our key roles is to promote linking research to policies. And so we are helping the university to do the research that can be aligned with the needs of the markets or the governments, and then we can actually channel these research into the end users. So I think that's the important work that we just started, but we need tremendous help in that area. For the last question about the other side of the reforms, especially you are right about the fragility of the transitions and the reforms, And then this is where our leaders have paid huge attention to ensure that there's peace and stability so that the economic growth can take off. On the other hand, we are also looking at the the other side of the equation where the prosperity and then more connection with the global markets can also help stabilize the politics. So I think this is where, if I may use a Maximo beautiful map, you can see a lot of the bright lights are all open up in the southern part of Myanmar, where you have a direct access to Thailand. And this is a kind of an economic gateway, which is wide open because we are also building a new Asian highway connecting Myanmar to Thailand as well as to Vietnam, all the way up to the whole Southeast Asia. And then this particular area is also where it used to be a lot of fightings and then a lot of armed conflicts. But the ethnic rebel movement, mainly about the Karen, the Mon, and Dawe people, they have already ceased fire for a long time ago, but somehow they are still waiting for others to join in. And so they are also getting frustrated with the huge time to wait until they can see the peace dividend. So I think this is where we are encouraging the development partners to pay attention, to actually go and engage on these regional governments so that the regional governments can deliver some of those economic programs more quickly, so they don't have to wait for the central government, which tends to be much busier with the peace agreements and all that. So I think this is where probably is the strategy that we are developing right now, how to let the regional governments to champion the reforms at the same time they can also contribute to the needs of the economic and social justice.
Thank you. Justin?
Maybe just I'll jump in on the crop diversity, stimulating crop diversity question. And you might have to remind me that a lot of people don't realize is that farmers were not given the choice in Myanmar for many years on what they could grow on their land if they had land. And it wasn't until, I think, 2013, was it the Farmer Choice Act? Was that the name? Yeah, the Farmer Choice Act, which I knew you were very involved in. Farmers Protection Act. And USAID was very involved in working with all experts and really advising how to actually change that. It seems like such a simple, change and sort of a no-brainer, but something that was extremely difficult and extremely important in how the Ministry of Agriculture worked. There were lots of policies that were extremely harmful to farmers, to businesses, and so just tweaks that are so obvious as that is where I think many groups, including USAID, have started, but also thinking on nutrition, doing a study on aquaculture. And this is to the domestic market, and for nutrition perspectives, it was illegal to convert paddy land, and I think technically on the books today, it is still illegal to convert paddy off-season into fish ponds. And there was a feel, and one other thing I have to say is that data in Myanmar is very hard to come by. And so a lot of, in 2013, many people were thinking that the population was 72, 73 million people. But after the census, it's 51 million. So, I mean, we're talking about extremely, and this is in the last few years. So just to give a context of the environment, and groups like CASD are really focusing on this in IFPRI, and we're trying to get more data. But all of these things have, so right now, people say no one grows. If you go and you ask people, this paper that was written sort of outlined that very few people would say that there's fish ponds actively, being grown in rice paddy. But if you actually go out to the field, there are plenty. And there was transportation policy that was changed on what you could transport and freedom to move goods across different states. And once that law, this is another example, once that law was reformed, aquaculture sales domestically and exports, something like tripled or quadrupled, because people now could actually put their fish on a bus and sell it to local markets and to bigger cities. And so it's sort of very basic changes have catalytic effects related to domestic markets, exports, and also choice. So I would say these are all things that we're trying to keep an eye on and ways to push for diversification. On the social governance, from USAID's perspective, it's not an either or question for us on economic growth or support of agribusiness or supporting farmers. Feed the Future is inherently focused on smallholder farmers, small businesses, but we really work on the connections where investment in sort of helping businesses thrive will also pull and include smallholders. And so that's just to be very clear, whenever I was talking about agribusiness, it's absolutely with the eye to reducing poverty, malnutrition, hunger. So I will say a few things that we've done and how we think about it is another issue that has been mentioned by everyone, but I can't stress enough is land policy. At times up to 80% of the Burmese population has been declared landless and have no access to land rights, and I know there's some changing on that. We've embedded an advisor in the land, the ministry is
Environmental Conservation.
Environment Conservation, Montek, or the land ministry to work on things like community forestry and how without a clear land tenure policy in place, and we deal with this all over the world, how can we still empower smallholders as well as businesses to actually thrive? And that's something that we've done a lot of work on, and there's a lot of work to go. But with your question towards NGOs, I think one of the difficult things, to be very honest, and this might not be a very politic thing for me to say, but it's a country that's been in civil war for over 60 years, right? There's a reconciliation process going on. And I will say USAID's number one goal in Myanmar is to accelerate and get return on democracy and deliver on the democracy. So that's of all inclusive: health, democracy, human rights, governance issues, transparency, food security, many, very holistic program. But we make sure that, we want to move things forward, and there's been so many fights between different ethnic groups versus the military. NGOs and civil society organizations who've existed in Myanmar and around Myanmar for years, who've been fighting at loggerheads. And it's very difficult because with every reform, there's a very large group that has a long history of disagreement. And so what we're really trying to do is create a policy dialogue that really includes everyone, but also advises all sides, what are some ways forward, right? It's not a black and white situation, it's gray all around. And so for us is really to move that dialogue, create a transparent dialogue and make sure that all stakeholders are there. And that's what we're trying to do on land. And it's inch by inch, but it's incredibly important for Myanmar to get those transparent policy dialogue systems up in place, so that then they're also the government's held to, implementing on the reforms. It's one thing to change a law, and we're seeing that a lot also with state governments. Not all state governments will implement what the federal government has changed, and so really engaging at that level is critical. And so for the role of organizations like yourselves, I think the policy transparency, trying to move things forward, trying to not get in corners one way, but sort of get this discussion further, and then actually have it not just based in Naypyidaw or Yangon, but also focused on implementation in the states. Those are all things that Myanmar, the government, the people really need help with. So I hope that is somewhat helpful.
Maximo?
Okay, only 3 comments. One on the domestic to international. I think the movement towards aligning relative prices and being transparent on relative prices will help enormously, and then the markets should operate. Now, given said that, and there was a question on incentives and how we do, I think we have learned a lot about that trying to pick commodities or trying to pick sectors is not the way to go. The role of the government is more to facilitate and give the rules of the game, and that is linked to property rights, is linked to access to infrastructure. It could be linked even to standards, it could be linked to third-party certification that will allow these producers to move in and to have access to it. But clearly, at least what we are observing in the photographs on the exports and imports, the market is demanding things which the country can supply. And that's where I think we need to focus on this idea of value chains, which will help to do that without needing to have distortion. One thing that is clear for us is that when we look at the level of distortions today to staple commodities across the world, it's impressive. Despite that, people still talk about we should move towards more nutritious food. Just switch 50% of those distortions to staples to high-value commodities, and there is a huge change. Okay, so I think removing distortions and making markets more clear is the way to go. Regarding the comment on economic growth, at least what I have seen in the Latin American countries that has been growing substantially in the last years, is that initially there was the idea that economic growth will spill and will create reduced poverty and malnutrition. We know that that doesn't work one-to-one. We know that we need to do changes to that, and that's the target policies, and that's where we talk about inclusive growth. But also now we know that inclusive growth is not enough, because what you want is to graduate those areas where you were giving transfers and so on and so forth. And that's when we are moving now to inclusiveness for growth. So basically, we require that if we want to keep growing, to be able to keep at the levels that we are. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question from the audience. You guys weren't expecting me to give you a chance to ask one more question, were you? Okay, then I'll let our panel, you can each have a sort of a closing statement, right? Zaul, any last thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for all your attention. And I think, if I may, I just wanted to remind you about the upcoming visit of our leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, to Washington, D.C. by mid-September. And then I think she will be appealing to the U.S. government to help Myanmar, and then we need a lot of help. And I think the agriculture sector is where we need most. And then it is very important that, as Justin's have already emphasized, when we talk about reforms, it has to be comprehensive. It needs to be holistic, and then you have to take the whole value chain approach. And I think we are privileged to work with the IFPRI and then also the many other experts in this area of study. And then I think this is the time to make many of our findings to be a real policy inputs for both our leaders as well as the United States government to come down to the real work, which is about implementation. I think this is where I think we also need more preparations, and then it also wanted to give you an upbeat about the implementation, because implementation is not easy, because I have been working very closely with the previous government for the last 5 years, and implementation is where we stuck, and then I think we need a lot of help. And the one thing which I may not have presented in my talk, which we need help, is the capacity. Capacity to implement is very key. And this is where I hope that we are not only doing research back in the country. I think many of our young researchers and also the scholars also needs to come out and also try to learn from others, because we are the latecomers and we can learn a lot from many others who have already done successful work ahead of us. So I think this is where I hope both the U.S. government and perhaps the IFPRI can also help us bring some of our young researchers and scholars to be able to learn in this country, and then also the build capacity when they go back. So with that, Pete, I'd like to thank you again, and I look forward to having our successful trip made by our leader in the coming weeks. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Justin?
I think Myanmar is a country that we, the U.S. government, are absolutely committed to, and there is an enormous potential. I think from a donor perspective, it's often, people frame effectiveness of donors often by how much money they commit to a country, and that sort of the ODA, how much are you spending? And there's no doubt that's very important. But I really do believe Myanmar is a great example where we will continue to financially support Myanmar, so I'm not saying we're moving away, but where things like effective advice and guidance on policy, I mean, I think I tried to lay out a few areas where there was catalytic change by just some tweaking of policies. Focusing on capacity, those are areas that actually are worth well more than the dollars that they actually take to make realized. And I think Myanmar, because there is so much potential, is a great example of that. And again, not to say we're not focusing on also money, but I think the conversation today made that really clear. And the last thing, I'll make a prediction, which I'm sure, I'm always wrong, but I lived in Asia for 10 years, China for many of the years, Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time working in Thailand, Vietnam, actually worked in textiles, very short time. But I think there's the sort of trajectory of growth of Myanmar, I don't think is going to follow sort of the path of many of the other Southeast Asian countries, the Asian countries where really the industrialization of Myanmar is really becomes a big garment hub, and then light manufacturing leads to more industrial manufacturing. I know that's a model that many countries have followed. I actually do believe that Myanmar is going to not just in the next 5 years or 10 years use agriculture as a way to sort of move into urban manufacturing and other types of diversified industry. I think that agriculture will be one of the more important industries for Myanmar into the far future, where you're actually seeing highly mechanized. It's just a country that is so well positioned, both geographically and ecologically, to be a major global competitive player in agriculture. And with a population relatively small for the size of the country, it will have to move into more highly specialized and modernized agriculture. And you can't skip the steps. You have to start smallholder growth and grow into that. But I do see a vision 20, 30, 40 years down the line where agriculture is still absolutely critical to Myanmar. So that's...
Maximo, very quickly, and then
very
Shannon
quickly,
will come.
I think that, like, I come also from a country of conflict for 30 years or more, and seeing the light out of the tunnel is great. So you just need to build a strong base so that you can move out and don't fall like what just happened a minute ago, that Dilma in Brazil just lost the presidency. So the second thing is, I think I agree with you in terms of agriculture, but I think we need to think more on rural development. Because agriculture alone won't do it. You need roads, you need all these kinds of things, and normally our countries fall in this problem of having a Ministry of Agriculture, which I will call a Ministry of Rural Development. But in any case, but we need to figure out a way to understand this as a multi-sectoral problem. Yeah. And also the last thing is South-South learning. I think there's so much to learn of what is happening in South-South countries. Of course we can learn from the North, but there is also so much in our context of lack of institutions and so on and so forward, where we can learn and jump steps rather than repeating the same mistakes than before.